Hello and welcome back to UnHerd. The bombing last night of nuclear facilities in Iran by the US military at Fordo, Natanz and Esfahan was a momentous departure in US foreign policy. That mission, direct action on Iranian nuclear facilities, has been considered and debated for years, if not decades, and has not been attempted. Internally, within the MAGA movement, it marks something very significant. The victory of one school of thought over another, the more interventionist, hawkish group over the more restrainist, as they like to call themselves, group that is more skeptical of foreign adventures. The president, in the end, ignored the restrainers who said, stay out, don't do this, and sided with the hawks. To explain both the security situation as well as the internal ideological battle within Donald Trump's group and administration, we're joined today by Dan Caldwell. Until recently, he was one of the most influential restrainers in the administration. He was the top advisor to the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. He was then ousted earlier in the year as part of an investigation into leaking information, and we're definitely going to ask him about that. In any case, he's now liberated from his security shackles. We're not going to ask him to divulge security clearance level information, but he is free to share his assessment of what is really going on. Welcome to UnHerd, Mr. Caldwell.
Well, thank you for having me.
So let's just start by kind of introducing you to our audience. You're a former Marine Corps soldier. You served in Iraq and you became a security expert, Middle East expert, and you were a senior advisor to Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, until earlier this year where you left the administration.
That is correct. I also spent some time in the American Congress, the House of Representatives. And in my time in the Marine Corps, I also deployed to Iraq as well.
And just so we acknowledge this, there was some controversy over the circumstances of your departure from the administration. It was somehow connected to an investigation into leaks. It was after the Signalgate episode. You haven't been accused formally, I don't believe, of leaking. That would have been a crime. What's the story from your perspective?
As I sit here today, I have not been charged with any crime. I have not been subpoenaed in any way. And all these allegations against me, most of which I would say have been anonymous, are completely and utterly false. And the biggest thing that I hope for is a chance for myself and the other two individuals, Colin Carroll and Darren Selnick, who are unfortunately looped up in this with me, that we have a chance to get our good names restored. It's been a very unfortunate experience. It's been, in a lot of ways, a devastating experience. In some ways, if there was more of a formal investigation and a formal process, I would have a clear path to an end here. But it's all very nebulous right now. And I think that most people have realized is that there's no truth behind these allegations. But the fact that there hasn't been a formal process or really a clear way for us to get formally exonerated has been disappointing. But at the end of the day, look, despite all that happening, I still have a lot of friends within the Department of Defense. There's a lot of good people there. And a lot of them are working their butts off right now to serve the country. And regardless of what happened with me, and I know Colin and Darren feel the same way, I want them to be successful. And I really am thinking a lot about them today and praying for them.
I think it would be really helpful, without you spilling kind of specific details, to just frame for our audience what this central argument within the administration has been. Because I think it is fair to say there are certain individuals that are much more keen on what they would call restraint in foreign policy. And part of that MAGA coalition has been about emphasizing the president's pledge to avoid foreign adventures, forever wars, look after America first, etc. And there are other individuals and groups that are more keen to kind of remain involved in these. Is that how we should understand it, that there are these two forces within the administration, and that perhaps in the last couple of days with the attacks in Iran, the less restrainist force has won out?
First and foremost, within the administration, and this is one reason why I really, truly did like working with the Department of Defense, is that there are a lot of people across the different agencies, whether we're talking Department of Defense, State Department, the NSC, the Vice President's Office, ODNI, of people who were friends, who largely had some of the same ideas about American foreign policy. Nobody was identical. And honestly, you don't want that. But we all had a broader shared belief that American foreign policy in the post-Cold War era had largely failed to make the United States safer or more prosperous. And so we were all kind of coming from that North Star. And the second belief was, and I think this is very, very important considering the current moment, is that we believe that it was not our job, if we lost an internal debate, to undermine the president. And this was a key problem in the first term, is you had people like former Ambassador Jim Jeffrey, who was a special representative for Syria, going around bragging about how he lied to President Trump about troop numbers in Syria to try and stop him from withdrawing troops. You had people like John Bolton undermining diplomacy with North Korea and so on and so on. So even if certain people may have lost an internal argument, they immediately pivoted to, and I know they're doing this right now, implementing the president's policies in the best way possible. But I think there is a larger fight that has been ongoing for a long time about the future of American foreign policy. And that is definitely playing out here in Washington, D.C., primarily within the media and the American academic and think tank space. And you have a group of individuals that really represent the pre-2016 Republican foreign policy consensus. And that is of interventionism, primacy, neoconservatism, whatever term you want to apply to that, but basically people who believe that America needs to be the dominant power in the world, essentially needs to be the policeman of the world to impose our values in different parts of the world. And they believe that is necessary for not just keeping the United States safe and prosperous, but for the broader flourishing of liberalism overall.
Who are the kind of figureheads of that group? I mean, you hear about General Michael Kurilla, sometimes called Kurilla the Gorilla. He's definitely on the kind of more hawkish side. John Ratcliffe, the CIA director. I mean, who are the standard bearers for the more interventionist side?
Well, within the administration, I will say I do think it is fair. He's been open about this in congressional testimony that General Kurilla favored a more aggressive approach in the Middle East. And in a lot of ways, that's what happens when you're commander of CENTCOM, is that your incentives are to pull in as many assets as possible and to make your combatant command the most important in the world. And that's why it's important that you have the Joint Staff and the Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, Secretary of Defense, to manage all of that. But I would say, in regards to Director Ratcliffe, one thing I would say is I would just be I would just be very cautious of reporting trying to put him in a certain camp or not. And I have heard two sides of the story, that he was very aggressively pushing for this, and others who said that's not accurate. Some people that I know and I trust have said very good things about John Ratcliffe, so I don't want to impugn him or try and speak for him without really knowing for sure where he's at. I can say confidently about what General Kurilla believes because he's been public about it. I've heard him say it, but Director Ratcliffe, not so much. I would say, again, outside though, I think it's fair to say is that you have prominent media voices at places like Fox News, and then you have institutions like the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, who are very out front and have been for a long time, pushing a more aggressive posture in the Middle East, specifically against Iran.
Right.
And those groups have actually become less influential within the Republican Party, but you can't deny is that in a lot of ways, they won at least the early part of this debate.
Meanwhile, on the other side, on the more restrainist side, as they like to call themselves, obviously there was yourself, but you're no longer in the administration. Elbridge Colby, who we've had on this show a number of times, is restrainist as regards the Middle East and Ukraine, less so as regards China. Rumor has it that he is less in favor with the president. Apparently his nickname is Bridge to Nowhere from the president. Mike Domino is another name that's mentioned. He's the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East, also favors a more restrained approach. And of course, the Vice President, J.D. Vance, is known to be on that side of the argument. Do you think that's a fair, rough summary of the key individuals?
Well, I would say that Bridge would not call himself a restrainer. I think the term he would use, and again, I don't want to speak for him, is a prioritizer, believing that, like restrainers, that the United States has limited resources, and as a result, we need to prioritize that in places where we have vital national interests at stake, mainly in the Pacific. And in regards to Mike Domino, I worked with Mike prior to joining the administration. I know him fairly well, and you can put him in that camp. But again, I just want to go back. Watching Mike within the administration is that his attitude was, I'm going to make my argument and I'm going to pivot and implement it. And nobody can really point to him. And I'm not saying, Freddie, obviously you're saying this, but others have accused him of certain things, but nobody can point to him and saying he's actually undermined something. But again, I do think it is fair to say you have individuals in prominent positions in the Department of Defense, ODNI, the Office of Director of National Intelligence, and people at the White House who have been very open about the fact that they think American foreign policy is broken and needs to be more restrained. And at times that has included the president himself.
And I suppose, just to put it bluntly, what happened this past weekend, what happened on Saturday, was the objective of the more interventionist group. I mean, war with Iran or direct engagement in Iran has been the kind of test of which of these two groups would win out. And right now, you've been evicted from the administration. You're talking to us here, but it feels like the Hawks have won.
I can't deny that the interventionist arguments ultimately were the ones that won out. However, I would say initially is that this is the beginning of what could be a longer military engagement. I hope that's not the case. But if the president ultimately does what he says he wants to do, and he's done this in the past with the Soleimani strike, with what happened to the Houthis, if he keeps it very narrowly focused on what is an American interest, and that is preventing Iran from getting a nuclear bomb, what I've said is on a vital national interest, and the risks of military action are high. If he keeps that focused and not get sucked into a larger regime change war, which is what a lot of the neoconservatives and more interventionists actually want. I truly believe that for a lot of people, this isn't actually about a nuclear bomb. It is about creating the conditions for a regime change or regime collapse in Iran, because at the end of the day, what has posed the most threat to certain parts of the region has not been a currently non-existent Iranian nuclear bomb, and they could, as a result of this, start really sprinting towards one, but it's been the missiles and the proxies and the nature of the regime itself. So ultimately, there's going to be a lot of pressure on the president, the vice president, secretary of defense, and others to expand America's scope of operations to join a broader regime change operation in conjunction with the Israelis and Iranian dissidents and others, which is fundamentally different than what the president wants. And you're already kind of starting to see that bubble up this morning. Arguments that saying, hey, to truly verify the damage to these facilities is we need people to go in and look at them. We need people to grab the nuclear material. Who are those people going to be? They're not going to be Red Cross volunteers. They're going to be American and likely Israeli commandos. And if you do that, now you've crossed the threshold into a ground war.
Right. So do you see that as the most likely vector towards expansion? Some kind of attempt to verify whether the facilities are still operational?
I think that is one place you're going to see a push on.
On that, we've seen a lot of satellite images in the last 24 hours that people have shared on social media as if they were somehow conclusive. To me, I've had a look at them. I'm no expert in obviously analyzing these things, but it's kind of hard to tell really much. They look like mountains before and mountains afterwards. Do you have any insight into whether these strikes were successful in actually destroying the main Fordo facility? I noticed that when J.D. Vance was on ABC News earlier, he was asked repeatedly, did the strike destroy the facility? And he kept using a different formulation. He kept saying it has set back Iran's nuclear program. It's definitely set it back, but it hasn't necessarily destroyed it. Is there anything you know or have observed about whether it actually worked?
There's a lot of very smart people right now in a number of different government agencies at the Pentagon and outside that are trying to do the analysis with the data they have. And it's difficult as we sit here today to make a definitive conclusion. What I will say is this, is that the United States has very robust long-range strike and airstrike capabilities. We saw that last night with the B-2 bombers essentially doing a, I believe, 34-hour round-trip bombing run from Missouri. And then you had about 30 Tomahawk missiles fired from the Persian Gulf. However, what we saw in the Houthi campaign, what we have seen in places like Yugoslavia, we often find that initially beliefs that we were successful in an airstrike and that our overwhelming air superiority allowed us to significantly degrade a certain capability of an adversary, that our initial assessments are often overstated. Again, it doesn't mean that's the case here.
And it's not like they didn't have any warning, it should be said. I mean, there's been images of them assembling trucks at the Fordo facility in recent days. I mean, they've had plenty of time to evacuate it, to get key equipment out or whatever it would be.
Correct.
This wasn't exactly a surprise attack.
Correct. And this gets into the broader point here. And just to sum it up, is air power is not a silver bullet. It is not a button that you can push to solve every problem. I express skepticism of this strike. I hope it was successful, that we did accomplish our objectives, and there's not a reason to escalate. And I also, too, hope that some of the dire predictions that I've made about potential second and third order consequences are wrong, because that would mean a lot of problems for the region. But the key thing going forward for the Trump administration is going to be the management of escalation with Iran, and making an honest assessment of, is the potential risks of more military action worth the potential or likely degradation of the Iranian nuclear program? Is it worth it? The risks of potentially more American lives lost in the Middle East versus rolling back the Iranian nuclear program maybe another 6 months or a year if we continue to escalate and continue to strike. Those are what they're going to have to balance. And then, of course, is there still an opportunity for diplomacy? And I think there's pretty good evidence that there is some back channeling, some signaling going on between the Iranians and the United States and other parties that hopefully provides us a path where we get off the escalation ladder and start getting back into serious diplomacy. It's going to be hard, don't get me wrong, but that in a lot of ways is the best outcome.
Just to zoom out for a moment, had you been inside the administration, you would have been arguing not to do this. That's fair, is it? That you would have said, do not do this strike.
I was very open with my skepticism about a direct military intervention in Iran in the administration. And I'm sorry if this sounds like a cop-out, though, but I wasn't seeing what others were seeing. And I don't have as a complete picture as they do right now. But I think it is fair to say, look, I've been open outside the administration. I was in the administration, wary about a direct intervention, and even before that.
And what was your main reason? What was your anxiety? Is it that if you begin with a strike like this, it kind of rolls the US into some wider conflict and they find themselves being dragged into a new long engagement that we don't want to see? That sums it up, is it? Is that what your anxiety is?
I think that is a fair way to put it. I was worried about the United States getting embroiled in another major conflict in the Middle East at a time where I think we need to be pivoting militarily out of the Middle East. I think that doesn't mean abandoning the Middle East. I mean, it working through our partners in the Middle East better, focusing more on what our actual interests are there, and the potential trade-offs caused by a larger war against higher order national security priorities, whether they're in the Western Hemisphere or in the Pacific. But I got to be honest with you, is that one major source of anxiety is what would happen to our troops in the region. And, I served on a base called Al-Assad in Western Iraq, where there are still American troops, and actually the vice president served there. A lot of actually veterans administration went through there. And in 2020, after the Soleimani assassination, that was the main air base targeted by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards for retaliation. And thankfully, that was telegraphed. We were able to prepare for it, but we still had over 100 troops that suffered some type of injury, including traumatic brain injury. Thinking through what is the individual impact going to be on some of these troops, and I know that some say to be a good advisor and analyst, you need to detach yourself from that. But I just have to be honest, is that was a huge source of anxiety to me, is that another generation of Americans like me 20 years ago would once again be in these wars, and many of them would suffer injury and, unfortunately, in some cases, maybe death. And that created a lot of anxiety.
Do you think that is now likely in the next few days or weeks that Iran, as part of its retaliation, seeks out US bases in the region? Because it's not exactly likely to attack the US mainland. That's something they can actually do.
God, I hope not. And I really, this is where diplomacy, back channel communication, and having good regional partners really comes into play. And, thankfully we have people like Steve Witkoff who've developed some of these relationships. I left the administration with a lot of respect for Secretary Rubio, Vice President Vance, others who really understood the importance of this. And the hope is the message is, like what the president said, is we're not aiming for a major regime change operation. We want to get back to diplomacy to end this problem. And that message is well received by the Iranians, and that causes them either not to retaliate directly against American forces, or they do some type of telegraphed symbolic response against an American base that is largely abandoned. That is in some ways the best or least worst outcome, but there's no guarantee that's going to happen.
If we're looking out in coming days and weeks for the signs of how this is playing out, in a way, a kind of good news story would be if there's some retaliation that actually doesn't cause any fatalities, that is almost a sort of internal public relations for the Iranian regime, that is a way of showing that they're doing something, but which isn't likely to escalate. That you think would be almost the best case?
Aside from the Iranians not retaliating at all, because they really, really see that the United States isn't going to do a regime change operation. They come to believe that. And again, that's going to be difficult to do. And they choose not to retaliate. The scenario you laid out is I think second to that, the least worst or best outcome. But here's the problem though, is that that doesn't necessarily tell the longer term story. Is that there's a lot of questions, unknowns right now that are going to play out in the next weeks, months, and years. One, does Iran walk away from the non-proliferation treaty? Does the supreme leader revoke his fatwa against developing a nuclear bomb, and therefore the Iranians are now truly sprinting towards a nuclear bomb? And despite best military efforts, they are able to achieve some type of nuclear capability. Does the regime collapse and Iran devolve into civil war, where you have bad actors that are able to get their hands on nuclear material? Does Iran over-retaliate? Do they strike our Gulf Arab partners who Iran has developed somewhat of detente with? And does that cause a spike in global energy prices that impacts the global economy in a very negative way? Those things are not going to play out over the next 2 hours or 2 days or even 2 months. Some of those things are going to play out over the next 6 months to a year to 2 years.
I mean, I guess there is another option, which is some really more direct retaliation. There could be ships, diplomatic facilities. There are a lot of potential targets if Iran wants to retaliate. And at that point, the question would be, would the US have to retaliate once again? And is that going to lead to an escalation? I mean, how likely is that kind of thing, do you think? And is that something you're worried about?
That is what you described as the worst case scenario. And that's where these higher projections of casualties come from. That's where you could get into the tens of thousands, unfortunately. How likely is it? Again, I'm sorry, this is a cop-out, but that's really unknown right now. If there is a retaliation and it does inflict American casualties, then you could see another American response that is larger, and then you could see another Iranian response which is larger, and then from there, the Iranians could expand their target sets. The Iranians could come to conclude that the Gulf Arab states are actually helping us, and then they start to strike American bases and diplomatic facilities in places like Qatar or Saudi Arabia or the Emirates. And that's where it gets really, really dangerous. And again, I hope we're not heading down that path.
It does seem, I mean, look, we are very, as you say, in very early day, in fact, but it has been quite striking how quiet the Iranian response has been, not only to the last 24 hours, but also to the Israeli strikes over the previous week. The impression that a lot of people have just accepted is that the Iranian regime is very weak and their abilities have been reduced. And that, in fact, your argument, the argument of the restrainers, is kind of predicated on Iran being strong. And it seems like they're weak at the moment. So maybe this was a good moment to strike.
That perception that Iran is truly weak and that doesn't possess significant offensive capabilities, that is where if that perception starts driving our strategy, that's where things can get really dangerous. I would note this is that.
Do you think it's wrong? Do you think they're not weak?
They have taken some blows, particularly over since October 7th. They've lost some of their key proxies. But I just note this is that within, I believe, about 30 minutes to an hour after the American strike, is that the Iranians launched a ballistic missile barrage at Israel. And if you look at the Israelis are heavily censoring their social media and their media and their television and media outlets, which is natural in war. You did have a not insignificant number of missiles from that barrage sneak through, and it caused damage to Tel Aviv and Haifa, and likely wounded dozens and potentially killed, unfortunately, some Israelis. So I bring that up because really what the war right now is, even about 12 to 16 hours after the American strike, is it's a race. It's a race between Israel and Iran to see who can destroy more of the other side's critical military equipment and exhaust their munitions. And this is where it is a key point, is that Israel, and I'm not revealing anything classified, this has been publicly reported by the Wall Street Journal and a whole host of other outlets, Israel is running out of ballistic missile interceptors. And when they run very low or exhaust them, even if Iran has a limited missile launch capability, they can inflict significant damage, not just on the Israelis, but other Americans in the region. So the point is that even with the significant Israeli military success over the past week and a half, Iran still possesses offensive capabilities that are dangerous to Israel, and they have a lot of capabilities that are extremely dangerous to Americans still in the region.
Just to understand this argument a little bit better, sometimes there is not exactly conspiratorial, but a sense that the other side, the Israel lobby in cahoots with the military-industrial complex, is this kind of vast and all-powerful network that always wins in the end. And sometimes people like Tucker Carlson do get pretty close to seeing the world like that. I just want to ask whether you see it like that. Are the forces in favor of more hawkish intervention tied up in this vast, powerful network? And how should we understand them?
First of all, in regards to the Israel lobby, how people talk about them, I think they act like that sometimes they're the only foreign lobby in the United States. We are unfortunately, I don't think this is good, because we have pursued primacy since the end of the Cold War, because we've shown a tendency to over-intervene. We're essentially the imperial capital. So much every country in the world has some type of lobby here in the United States. We have a very robust Turkish lobby. We have an Armenian lobby. In fact, in the 2022 Senate race in Pennsylvania, the Armenian lobby dumped millions of dollars trying to defeat Dr. Oz and actually helped elect John Fetterman. This is a natural outgrowth of us trying to be this hyperpower and the dominant power in the world. And so I can't blame foreign countries, and again, it's not just Israel, for wanting to try and influence our foreign policy. Who I do blame is American politicians for not centering our foreign policy on our own national interests. Now, in regards to our military-industrial complex, yes, I mean, this has been a significant motivator for how our military is structured. They invest significantly in institutions that advocate for a more interventionist foreign policy. And this is exactly the system that Dwight Eisenhower warned about in his farewell address. And again, President Eisenhower was not saying we don't need a military-industrial complex, is that we shouldn't have this, but he said this was a natural outcome of building one that we need to guard against and make sure that the influence doesn't cause us to lose sight of our national interests. And so again, a lot of people can complain all they want about this lobby or that. At the end of the day, though, it's our politicians and policymakers who are choosing not to prioritize American interests.
The reverse view, I guess there is a somewhat conspiratorial view of your own side of the argument as well, which I hear from even people I respect, interesting commentators, and they might call yourself and some of the people putting forward the so-called restrainist argument almost like the Iran lobby. Or these are people who seem to want Iran to have the bomb because in some way it would equalize or create some kind of new equilibrium in the region. We had John Mearsheimer here on the show last week, and he went close. He was very careful to say that he thinks it would be very much against America's interests for Iran to get a nuclear bomb. But he almost said it's kind of fair enough for them to have a bomb because Israel does, and it's a very effective deterrent. So maybe if they did, there'd be less war. How do you respond to people who say that yourself and the group who are urging more restraint are, in effect, the pro-Iran getting a bomb group?
People who are saying that and questioning my patriotism or the patriotism of people like Mike DiMino, Joe Kent, Bridge Colby, they can go pound sand. I'm listed in the United States Marine Corps in the middle of the Iraq War. I deployed to Iraq. Mike DiMino, he was served in the CIA, and one of his jobs was to track down and to help kill Iranian proxies. People like Joe Kent, the same thing. You know, those guys have more Iranian proxy bodies on them than a lot of these keyboard warriors spouting that bullshit. Sorry for my language, but it's nonsense. I don't think it is in America's interest for Iran to have a bomb. I think the best way to do that in the long term is through a diplomatic resolution like the president is trying to achieve. And again, whether or not these strikes is going to make that difficult remains to be seen. I do not think it is in America's vital national interest first, though, to risk and to ultimately get involved in another Middle East war because it will distract us from more urgent national security priorities, whether in our own hemisphere or in China. The Middle East has about 5% of the world's population and 5% of the GDP. East Asia, I believe, has about 60% of the GDP, and I believe about 30-40% of the world's population. I could be wrong on that. Just, it is simply more important. We have extremely limited resources right now because of dumb decisions made by the politicians that the very people who are accusing us of undermining national security, the very people that they supported, people like George W. Bush, people like Joe Biden, Dick Cheney, all those people that share kind of that belief that America needs to be this global hegemon to impose liberalism across the world. They're the ones who have ultimately made America less safe and less prosperous. So I'll just say this, is that our country was founded on a belief that foreign interventionism is fundamentally dangerous to the health of a republic. Our first president, George Washington, went out of his way to warn about that in his farewell address. Almost all the founding fathers, in one way or another, warned the United States about foreign entanglements, about permanent alliances, about too much affinity for countries not our own. Our beliefs are rooted in an American tradition, and we are trying to revive that tradition. It's not isolationism. The United States has never been a truly isolationist power. It is prioritizing our own interests and understanding that when we do use force, it has to be tied to those core national interests.
So what for you would be the test of success on that? Let's say we talk again in 4 weeks' time. What do you hope for now? Is it that this was it? It was the one and done, and now somehow nothing else happens and that's the end of the story? Is that a reasonable hope? I mean, what do you think the best case scenario is in the next few weeks?
Honestly, I hope that some of the confident predictions of some, I think I will say, I think there are some commentators who supported this who legitimately don't support regime change and do think we can keep this limited. I hope those people are right, is that we're able to do this. There's no or very limited Iranian response that doesn't push us into an escalation spiral. And that while it's going to be incredibly difficult, there is a pathway back to diplomacy, to some type of a diplomatic resolution or a status quo prior to this, where there is still tension in the region, but there's not outright warfare. As I hope, bottom line, in 4 weeks, I hope that the shooting has stopped. Because if it hasn't stopped, we're heading in a very dangerous direction. So that's what I hope is going to happen. And again, I hope the worst, most dire predictions don't come true, including the ones that I've made, and that, I can be here and say I was wrong about many of those predictions. But it's going to be very difficult, and it's going to require a lot of depth, diplomacy, and escalation management by the Trump administration.
Final question for you, Dan, before I let you get on with your afternoon. How damaging do you think it is to the president's political message? I mean, part of what he was brought into office with was the statements like he's the peacemaker in chief. He ends wars, he doesn't start them. He was very proud of the fact that there were no new wars during his first term. This does seem to go against a core part of his political message. How damaging do you think it is?
If this becomes a long, drawn-out war, if this truly becomes a quagmire, there is really a risk that the whole second-term agenda is thrown off course. And this happened in the George W. Bush administration. This happened with Lyndon Baines Johnson, is that these extended wars not only suck away resources, but suck away bureaucratic and political attention. And it really has a way of consuming an administration. And so, like, if you think of the president's day or the vice president's day, if they're having to devote more and more time to focusing on this war, and I'm not even getting into the conversation about money or DOD resources, anything like that, it's less time to focus on key issues like immigration or fixing the economy. If there's a massive sustained spike in oil prices in the medium term, which could be caused by this, over time, supply chains will adjust. But if there is a short or medium term energy spike, that hurts the fight against inflation. So that's where I think if this turns into a long, drawn out conflict, I think that's where the political risk comes. And I do think that the White House and people around the president and vice president know that.
And do you think the president himself knows that? Because he sounded in his speech pretty excited about Netanyahu's involvement, about the military might, about almost the glamour of the mission, how powerful and effective it had been. It didn't sound like he was feeling like in peace mode. Do you feel he's been turned away from that more restrainist agenda?
I will note the messaging from the administration this morning was about this is going to be a very narrow, contained operation if the Iranians, don't retaliate. But the consistent message from the Secretary of Defense, the Vice President, the Secretary of State is, we don't want this to be a regime change or long, drawn-out war. They were, admittedly very belligerent about the Iranian regime, which by no means is a good one. There was some very blunt and direct talk. But again, from the president's truth last night to what was said this morning by the key decision makers in the administration, they clearly don't want to get drawn into a longer war. And I would just note that, for the Secretary of Defense and for the Vice President, they both served in a long, drawn-out war that wasn't in America's national interest. So I believe that those experiences is front of mind for them. But again, that doesn't mean that in the long term, just because they don't want it to happen, doesn't mean it won't happen because of mismanagement of how we escalate or how we do diplomacy. There is a risk, that still an immense risk, that this becomes a long, drawn-out conflict that does distract from more urgent priorities.
Dan Caldwell, thank you for talking to UnHerd today.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thanks to Dan Caldwell, former top advisor at the Pentagon to Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, outside the administration now, talking really very passionately about his view of why America should be more limited in its foreign adventures, more skeptical of the kinds of things that we saw in the past few days, and his anxiety that it could escalate very quickly and may prove to have been a fool's errand. Thank you to him for joining, and thanks to you for tuning in. This was UnHerd.